I made this presentation to about 1,500 post-exit founders, so people who've sold their companies, so entrepreneurs. And one of the slides in that presentation is, it shows this weight, and on one side is like health versus wealth. And basically at some point in life, health becomes a lot heavier than wealth. It becomes the dominant concern. Everybody is nodding furiously in agreement. And then when you say, and you know that aging is the top impact factor on your health. And then you say, and how much energy or money have you put towards the topic of aging? Basically, the nods disappear and it's a complete silence.
Would you want to live as long as you want to and in optimal health? Do you believe that life and health are good and that death is humanity's core problem? If so, you may be a vitalist. Our guest in this episode is Adam Gries, who is a serial entrepreneur and software engineer. He has sold 4 companies and built apps and games reaching over 80 million users. Adam is a big reason that I'm involved in the longevity movement and that I am doing this podcast, since he introduced me to what may be called the global longevity movement about 1.5 years ago. Together with Nathan Cheng, he's the founder and inventor of the exciting concept of vitalism and the movement of vitalism. Vitalism describes itself as a moral philosophy and a community of action, forming a revolutionary movement to get humanity to fight as hard as possible to achieve unlimited lifespans in peak health. Adam, welcome to LEVITY.
It's such an honor to be here. Great to see you guys.
Thank you for coming. The format today will be different. We will let Adam tell his story and present on vitalism, and then we will have a conversation about it. For full disclosure, I am a card-carrying member of the Vitalist movement, and Peter?
Yeah.
You as well, right?
Right.
So, since this is a presentation, the slides will be visible on our YouTube version of this podcast. If you're just listening now, you can go to LEVITY on YouTube and you'll find the presentation. So, Adam, take it away.
Thank you, guys. I'll be giving a brief presentation about vitalism, and then I'd love to just take it from there and discuss all manner of wide-ranging things that relate to life, death, and our goal to be happy and well as long as possible. So vitalism, Patrick gave a really good introduction. You can see on this slide, if you're looking on YouTube. If you're not, it just talks about my background. I'm a serial entrepreneur. I like to say that I had been interested in longevity, and by that I mean extending lifespan and great health indefinitely from probably my early 20s. I was a bit of a late bloomer in some sense compared to some other vitalists, in that even though I realized that life was good, I didn't really think very much about death until a little bit later. When you're very young, you have this sense of invincibility and that death is a very, very far off thing you don't really need to consider. And I actually spent a lot of my time thinking about what is the nature of consciousness, the human condition. That led me down the rabbit hole of Vipassana meditation, which I did a lot of, and eventually led me to study neuroscience, among other majors in my undergraduate learning. And it was only in my early 20s that I, having been exposed to Aubrey de Grey's Longevity, Escape, Velocity seminal talk, thought, okay, yes, we should be doing something about extending lifespans and defeating aging right now. And I'm glad that somebody's doing something about it. But basically, I like to say I hibernated. So I thought, well, Aubrey's a smart guy. There's some other people working on this, and maybe I can climb Maslow's hierarchy, build myself up. I was a poor student at the time. I didn't have many resources, nor a biology PhD, to give me the sense that I could make an impact. I didn't have that sense in any event. That changed during COVID around 3.5 years ago, when I had this experience where I saw COVID happen the way it did, and predicted how it would unfold pretty early on, and was shocked by the gaslighting and all the communication and failures that were happening. And that led me to conclude that really, in a way, time was up and I had to focus on longevity, because otherwise the outcome would be dire. So where everybody I loved, including myself, was going to age and die in the way that all generations had before. And I refused to accept that. And in general, I'll just say, before jumping into the presentation, the rest of the presentation, that I, like many people, delegate certain decisions and mental models of the world to sources of authority, or hope that people who seem to be experts at certain things will deliver a specific outcome. And COVID, I believe, showed many that the emperor was wearing no clothes, or that there was no wizard behind the curtain, so to speak. And that, I think, is a really great opportunity for us to jump into action, which is what we ended up doing with Vitalism. So first, I'm going to define and understand our problem. So what is this issue with not addressing aging and not addressing death? How do we describe it? Then I'll talk about Vitalism itself, why we need a movement, and what is this movement. I'll speak a little bit to longevity today overall, to kind of couch the context here, and then I'll discuss Vitalism's concrete plans. Our goal is to live in great health for as long as possible. And I think that about 99.9% of people would agree with this goal. I added a small asterisk by saying postponing aging and death indefinitely. This is very important, because if you think about this sentence, live in great health for as long as possible, really the only thing that may bring up a question mark is the word possible, right? Because who doesn't want to live in great health for a long time? And when you just look at the word possible, it's really difficult to argue that something will be impossible, given the range of historical examples where humanity has proven differently. Now, 80% of us are on track to die of aging. It's not a choice. And the things that are going to kill us, these so-called diseases of aging, are nothing more than a direct result of aging itself. They're not innocuously related. For example, some people say age-related diseases, as if there's some vague relationship. The relationship is not vague. Aging is the cause that leads to the outcome of disease and death. Now, we actually, as a society and as a species, make a huge effort to fight aging and death, except we do it in the silliest way. We wait until people are very old, and then we spend huge amounts of money keeping them alive for a mere handful of years, often in poor quality, about $1 trillion a year in the US alone. Meanwhile, we spend over $100 billion a year on quote-unquote anti-aging interventions that really only make a superficial difference, may make people look better, maybe feel a little better, but they're not influencing aging itself. And I'll just add to that, that if you take a global view, our entire society is built upon this kind of belief that aging is inevitable and we have to structure for it. Otherwise, why does the US and many other countries spend something like a third or more of their national budget on Social Security, pensions, and some sort of healthcare for the elderly? It's because humanity acknowledges or professes this belief that once you reach a certain age, you cannot be a productive economic member of society, and therefore you have to be paid for. This is unbelievable. And this money is coming out of each and every person's pocket in their taxes right now today. We're talking about a third of the national budget of most countries. So we are spending a huge amount on aging, but we're only using Band-Aid solutions. That's the insanity here. So trillions of dollars per year. Aging causes the most death and suffering, but solving it at the root cause with science and technology gets peanuts, almost nothing. You can see in the NIH budget, it's about 0.5%. So 1/200th of the 56 to 60 billion NIH budget, which is the largest biomedical funder of research in the world, based in the US. In biotech investing, longevity biotech receives about 3% of all investing, and that's supposed to be the most cutting edge, novel stuff that's pushing the envelope. And in the public sector, when you look at pharma and biotech, longevity biotech is only less than 50 billion out of 5.4 trillion. So we are talking tiny, tiny amounts. In fact, the amount of money going to solving aging through science and technology in the US, which is the largest funder, is less than a tenth of the US budget for national parks. Now, some think that today's meager resources might be enough. They say, well, maybe we'll get one incremental success and then suddenly there'll be a big inflection. So maybe we'll extend a mouse's lifespan by 100%. So mice will live double as long, and then we'll get a large amount of interest that, hey, this is possible. Or maybe some private moonshots may work. So even though they have tiny funding, maybe something will work. Or billionaires will step in with more funding. There was Altos Labs that recently got $3 billion, the largest seed round in history, just a year or two back, to try to pursue epigenetic reprogramming as a solution for aging. Even though they're not very explicit about the goal being substantially extending lifespans for all sorts of reasons that have to do with communication strategy. And then others lean into this idea that AI will save us. So a kind of almost semi-religious or hopium-oriented mental model. And funding is not the only problem. It still takes 10 years from lab to clinic. It's extremely hard to try things in humans. And many of our best and brightest are busy optimizing clicks. This is very important to understand, that the funding, the policy, and the psychological resistance that most people have and the mainstream has to confronting aging and death while pouring vast amounts of money distills into the situation where the sources of authority in society are telling the mainstream that we are doing the best we can about aging and death. So in some sense, the competition here is for authority, status, and influence. Outside of just pure funding, those things are downstream. And in this context, it should be no surprise that in 2024, we still have 0 interventions approved for aging in humans. On the psychology side, people are strangely bipolar about aging and death. We embrace but then reject the transformative power of science, saying that aging is uniquely inevitable and can't be modified, even though we have scientific evidence absolutely to the contrary. We've extended mouse lifespans substantially. We've modified worm lifespans by 10x, which was unthinkable only 30, 35 years ago. We say we're fine with dying at the average lifespan, but as we saw earlier, we spend our entire net worth sometimes to eke out another year or two, and the government spend vast amounts of money. And people make up all these zany objections, overpopulation, boredom, as if those would ever come up as rational arguments in any other context in terms of their level of merit. And of course, you could always say, if we had some problem, a social problem, would the first solution that we would jump to be, let's just let people die in this very painful way? And of course, publicly people say that aging is fine, but then privately they go to war with Botox, wellness clinics, and you name it. This pattern of psychological resistance is well expressed in the billionaire paradox, which is the fact that of 6,000 or more billionaires in the world, only 0.01% of their net worth is allocated to this topic. So only about 1 in 200 billionaires actually has put anything into longevity and aging, which is contrary to a popular conception that billionaires want to live indefinitely, pour vast amounts of money. Absolutely not true. Actually, this is just sensationalism. Billionaires are just like everybody else with a few twists. They have these zany objections. They're waiting for a good plan. So in other words, they'd rather die than try to do something to develop a good plan or hire somebody for $1 million to come up with a good plan. They believe in an afterlife. So that's a common reason. They don't need to think about living longer because, hey, the problem is solved, right? Even though, aging still happens and that's a lot of suffering. They don't like thinking about nasty things. I mean, what's the point of being rich if you have to think about nasty things? They may be shielded by minders. So sometimes what happens is an ultra high net worth person reaches out to somebody they consider an expert or are connected to an expert in longevity. And then that person has their own agenda and they basically funnel any interest into that agenda, which ends up being really quite limited. Or there are different minders who just prevent access to the ultra high net worth individual in the first place. Some think it's a lost cause. And by the way, if you're a billionaire who's 70 or 80 years old, that might make sense for you, right? Because the timelines may not work out. And that's a rational assessment. Many are afraid of what people may think, so bad PR, or have these confabulations about bad global outcomes, which is kind of absurd. It's like, what will we do when there are 30 billion people on Earth, where the reality is, of course, we have a shrinking population, and by the time we can't even predict who will win the next election in 7 months, let alone what's going to happen in 50 or 100 years when there may or may not be more billions of people. And the irony is that even the billionaires who do acknowledge that this is a problem and do put in some money into it, like Peter Thiel, acknowledge that they should do much more about it. In fact, Peter Thiel said in an interview for The Atlantic in November 23, quote, "I should be investing way more money into this stuff. I should be spending way more time on this." And yet, for some reason, he and others simply can't bring themselves to. And in addition, a vicious cycle holds us back. The diseases of aging then impact patient groups and drive a pharma lobby, an entire sick care machine, which influences elected officials to then define mandates for agencies such as the NIH or FDA, and that governs where the research funding goes. And so it's no surprise that there's much less funding going to these places that actually would solve the root cause. The squeaky wheel gets the grease. And as we know, in general, politics and humans are about short-term reward. You can see it in the stock market, you could see it elsewhere. So investing long-term in science to solve aging is something that's going to be very hard. But aging is solvable. We've seen evidence of that since 1993, when Cynthia Kenyon discovered a single gene mutation that doubled the lifespan of C. elegans worms. And since then, people have extended those lifespans by up to 10x. And in 2006, Shinya Yamanaka, who won the Nobel Prize later, demonstrated that adult cells can be induced to become pluripotent stem cells. So this idea that the knowledge of how to create youth from elderly or older cells is not lost. And we can see that also with cloning, where animals, so you can take the DNA of an animal, and by the way, it seems also a human is already possible to do. And when you take that DNA, for example, in a sheep, and you put the DNA inside an egg and implant that in a separate animal, and then bring the resulting embryo to term, that embryo has a normal lifespan with the same DNA. So the knowledge about how to be youthful is not lost. And then finally, we know that there are examples in nature, like naked mole rats, that don't have increasing mortality with age. So there are amazing points of evidence that should give us optimism that we can change aging soon. And humanity is able to achieve great things when it puts its mind to it. The Human Genome Project, for example, was thought impossible when it was initiated and eventually took 10 years to complete and only $3 billion. The Apollo project got 0.4% of GDP and included 400,000 people. And that would have been $100 billion per year today to get to the moon, not to speak of other major initiatives that happened in wartime. So we can do a great deal. We should fight aging and death on that level. And there's so many things that we can do. We could give scholarships. We could create more R&D programs, erect institutes, create incentives for key talent, consolidate data, open data, collect biomarkers and stem cell banks, and much, much more. And of course, create better and cheaper regulatory paths, let alone move from sick care to actual healthcare, which is solving root problems. But for that, we need a type of revolution in resource allocation. Let's not be naive. When you're talking about 33% of the national budget of countries, it would be absurd to think that this will just be moved. There are so many people dependent and connected to this level of resource allocation in society that you need a type of revolution. And that's what Nathan Cheng, my partner in creating Vitalism, and I realized that that was the order of magnitude that we had to strive for, a revolutionary change. And we look to revolutions of the past to be inspired. Mormonism, Christianity, communism, and others. More recently, you could say climate change was a revolution of resource allocation. These revolutions took anywhere between hundreds of years to as little as 40 years to come about. And they followed a very distinct pattern. They started with a small, very committed group that worked to get some sort of beachhead and then found inflection. So in other words, this is a theory of change that says, if you need a revolution, you can't just think that you're going to go out there and convince the mainstream by, putting out tweets or just creating content. You need to first attract a committed group. And that's part of the core idea behind Vitalism, what we believe the Vitalist strategy should be. So what's holding us back from achieving this? There are 4 core things we've identified. One is fragmentation. Another is death apologetics. A third is self-marginalization and poor communication. And a fourth has been a lack of a cohesive, plausible strategy to gain influence. Let's start with fragmentation. So there may be a lot of people, and we estimate that something like maybe 5 to 10% of people are what we would call natural vitalists. So in other words, when asked, how long do you want to live? They just intuitively say, hey, as long as possible, as long as I'm healthy. Living longer is great. They don't put some arbitrary number, which is maybe some sort of received wisdom from society, which is a kind of a convention. Like, oh, well, my grandma lived to 90, so 90 or whatever it is. And we know, by the way, that those kind of answers are also jurisdiction dependent. So if in your jurisdiction people live to 80, people tend to say 80. Whereas if in another one they live to 70, people tend to say lower numbers. How do we solve this fragmentation? People everywhere, and they don't know of one another. There have been attempts like the anti-aging movement or the transhumanist movement or even the longevity movements. Those movements, you could say, are kind of labels that help people orient to find each other and collectively project influence to achieve their goal, right? But the problem is that generic names like anti-aging and longevity end up being appropriated by groups that have widely different and sometimes, maybe even often, conflicting agendas. So for longevity, that word now includes organizations that say, hey, it's fine to die at 90 as long as you don't have the specific diseases, or it's all about health span. Some people are just selling a supplement. With anti-aging, you have folks who, are trying to promote a supplement or a cream, or that say that all that matters is just feeling and looking younger, but not the biology or not the research at all. And then if you look at transhumanism, it's a pretty wide philosophy, which doesn't necessarily say that aging or lifespan is the top priority. Of course, some transhumanists do believe that, but these different names make it very difficult for people who want to make aging and death humanity's number one priority to coordinate. And that's why we needed a new name, which is vitalism. Now, a second thing that holds us back is death apologetics. So, death apologetics are basically a kind of nod to a mainstream that says death is inevitable. So don't try to live longer than your allotted time, which of course is kind of absurd because, the average lifespan in the 1800s, the life expectancy, was about 40 or 50. So of course, at that point, people would say, hey, the problem isn't with death. The problem is just dying young, meaning at 30 instead of 40 or 50. Of course, this is absurd. We constantly move the goalposts. Because human society is so built around this concept of the inevitability of aging and death, many have found that when they try to promote alternative ideas, they suffer negative consequences. So if you said, hey, I want to work on aging to eliminate it, maybe you wouldn't get grants. This was 10, 20 years ago. Maybe it's still the case. And so because of this gravity of the mainstream, many folks who actually do want to defeat aging and death will say things like, oh, I don't want to live forever. Longevity's goal isn't to live to 200, it's just to be healthier. Or all sorts of death apologetics that cross the line into what I would call the unethical. Unethical in the sense that they don't hold the line that death is bad, which Patrick Linden has expressed so clearly in the case against death. Another problem is self-marginalization and poor communications. So if you want to get influence, you need to speak mainstream language. You can't use certain words that are going to lend themselves to marginalization, trivialization, demonization, or stigmatization, all of which are tools that mainstream use that the mainstream will tend to use, intentionally or not, to suppress alternative viewpoints. This is something that the community that cares about this has not really done well. And then finally, we believe that we were lacking a cohesive, plausible strategy to gain influence and to win. One common theory of change that's been around for a while is this idea that we'll hit some incremental milestone and that will open a tsunami of interest in confronting aging and death. So a milestone could be doubling a mouse's lifespan. So far, we've only extended mouse lifespans by the way, only in quotations. It's really quite amazing, but we've extended mouse lifespans by maybe 30 or 40%. So there's this idea that if we get to 100%, that would open the floodgates. Then there's this idea that maybe we just need one drug that influences lifespan in the market, even if it's for dogs or companion animal of a different type. And that would both prove that we could get through the regulators and also demonstrate a market for this stuff, which would then, again, open these floodgates of funding and interest. And then finally, there's this idea that many biotechs are pursuing that we'll just get some sort of stepping stone indication approval. So we'll have a drug which is, for something which is not directly aging, but is related. So maybe atherosclerosis or sarcopenia or something else. And then once that gets approved by the FDA, people will use it off-label for longevity, and that in turn would unlock major interest, funding, et cetera, et cetera. We just find these implausible and unlikely to get to that goal. So in other words, they may be important milestones in their own right. It may be that some of the companies working on these things would become billion-dollar or very successful companies, but we don't believe that that'll deliver the kind of revolution that we need. So what is vitalism? It's a revolution for humanity to make solving aging and death its number one priority, and reflect that through budgets, culture, and policies. On our website at vitalism.io, you can see in the header, we're not shy about what we're trying to do. The entire subject line in the hero says, finally, a great plan to save us from aging and death. And I'll just highlight here that many organizations that self-identify as longevity organizations don't have the word death anywhere on their websites, not even buried in some forlorn page. This is incredible. And it's a result of this kind of concern that might ruffle the feathers of the mainstream or cause other harmful impacts. But if you don't talk about a thing, how can you solve that thing? It's really quite remarkable because it doesn't even elevate death to the level of one notable negative outcome of aging. Not even the primary one, but it's not even elevated to a notable outcome of aging, which is just unbelievable. It should be quite remarkable to anybody that the word death doesn't appear on the vast majority of these organizations' website. One of the first things we realized when we started Vitalism was that it was important to codify a set of simple values that people who want the same things we want share. And that's how we, alongside many others, including Patrick, came up with this Vitalist Declaration. The Vitalist Declaration has 5 statements, which I'll read out. The first one, life and health are good. Death is humanity's core problem, and aging its primary agent. This is actually potentially quite contentious. Is death humanity's core problem? That's what we believe, but not everybody does believe that. It puts aging as something which is primarily a problem because of death, and secondarily because of the suffering. And this is very important because in many philosophies or approaches, it's actually the other way around. Aging is the primary problem and death is the secondary problem. Suffering is the primary problem and non-existence is the secondary problem. Number 2, aging causes immense suffering. Most people agree with that. And obviating it is scientifically plausible. Also, pretty wide agreement on that. Number 3, humanity should apply the resources to reach freedom from aging. Number 4, I will work towards or support work to reach unlimited healthy human lifespan. And number 5, I'll carry the message against aging and death. So if you agree with these statements, that makes you a vitalist. It has nothing to do if you're affiliated with this or that organization. The idea was to create something which is philosophical that anybody could adopt if they felt aligned with it. Now, for us to accelerate the realization of these values, we created Vitalism Foundation, which is basically just a group of committed vitalists who are creating the growth engines to build out and power this revolution. Now, our theory of change in vitalism is that a small, but maybe not too small, committed group of people can lead to a massive change. But the people do need to be committed, at least to some degree, meaning they need to be willing to do something. Because people who do something end up doing more things and then causing change. And that's how we came up with this definition of mobilized vitalists. A mobilized vitalist is just anybody who agrees with vitalist values and wants to do something about it and does something about it. So our idea is that if we can grow the number of mobilized vitalists to a certain level, we can drive massive change. Now, a big question then became, well, how does one get recognized as a mobilized vitalist? What is the set of things that one could do to be recognized in that way? And so what we did starting out was we said, well, look, you could volunteer, you could start an organization, you can do many things to be recognized, and we want to make those available over time. But initially, we'll just set a small financial commitment, which anybody should be able to make, which is a common threshold. Because if you're willing to pay even $1 for anything, that means you're willing to take some action. If you're not taking the action, then some other vitalist can use that dollar to help propagate some action. And in fact, even though we have price tiers, so we have a certain cost, a certain fee, level of fees that one could join with, if somebody can't afford it for whatever reason or can only spend a smaller amount, we make that possible as well. It's really not about maximizing the revenue from this, even though we believe that, hey, if you can afford a few tens of dollars, et cetera, a month, then you should be putting them to work to try to promote this kind of strategy. That definitely is our position. Now, also, this idea that the mobilized vitalists would be funding this movement and this group themselves is very important because it means that we can retain independence. We're not dependent on the whims of one ultra high net worth person or grant or context or donation. And of course, this does put the onus on Vitalism Foundation to provide value and show that this support is justified, which is what we do in a diversity of ways, which I'll speak about more. They include events, a private community, private content, helping people spark initiatives and businesses to amplify the Vitalist ecosystem, and many advantages in accessing therapeutics and longevity interventions that we have special access to, among other things. Now, I want to put some numbers on this just so people have a sense for what this kind of strategy can produce. So if you want to make change, you would really benefit from having 500 to 1,000 vitalists who are willing to take action in one city. We don't have that anywhere in the world yet today. We only started this organization about 8 months ago. And if you think about it, to get 500 to 1,000 people in one city, well, some people may already be there, but some may need to relocate. How many people can relocate? Well, maybe 10% of a group of people would be willing to relocate. And so if you imagine that half the people are already there, let's say, and half relocate, well, you would need 2,500 mobilized vitalists. And if you think about that, it also makes sense that that number can also support financially a certain number of what I would call full-time revolutionaries, people producing public goods and creating the kind of cartilage and infrastructure to allow the revolution to flourish. In every revolution in the past, there were some full-timers. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, and others. Some of them were just independently wealthy, others for other reasons, and you can see that in other revolutions as well, were able to dedicate themselves fully to that cause. And by having community supporting that, we can enable quick progress. In addition, companies also support Vitalism by giving different benefits to our members. Everybody from Fitness City to Ageless RX and more. These are companies that offer different health services, blood testing, longevity interventions, etc. And they're often led by Vitalist founders. And that set is growing larger and larger. And many of these organizations are also going to be recognized as Vitalist organizations, thereby helping amplify the entire ecosystem. Now, I'd like to take a step back and say a few words about longevity in general today. So why is longevity, that word, suddenly in vogue? Everything from Peter Attia, Andrew Huberman, Brian Johnson, David Sinclair, why are these things coming up? Books like Ageless by Andrew Steele becoming a bestseller. The thing is, people have been spending on wellness and health forever. So why suddenly? And even the word longevity was already in use in the 1970s. There's a book by this guy, Albert Rosenfeld, called Pro-Longevity, published in the 70s, which actually talks about a lot of the things that we still talk about today. So why is there so much visibility now? One reason is that aging has us on track to insolvency. So I mentioned earlier that we spend maybe about a third of our national budgets on aging. And if you look historically just at Medicare spending in the US, in 1970, the US spent $7.5 billion per year on Medicare, which is basically healthcare for those who are retired. Over 65, I believe, is the limit in the US to get Medicare. Today, that spend is nearly $1 trillion a year. Unbelievable. And in addition to that, there's this kind of pressure cooker of megatrends that are secular, that is just pushing us to confront aging, kicking and screaming as humanity may be, to confront it in a real way, meaning to do something about the fact that the Band-Aid solutions to aging are simply insufficient. What are these trends? One is that life expectancy has been surging since the 50s, and therefore costs surging. And we see that in Medicare. I was thinking about a funny story about this that I'll mention briefly now, which is that a friend of mine got a role as an assistant professor at a university, pretty well-known university recently. And the chancellor gave a speech to incoming professors on one of the first weeks. And the chancellor said, hey, the university budget is $1.5 billion a year, but a third of that goes to pensions for retired professors. And people were shocked. And the chancellor explained, when they created the pension policy in the 80s, the average lifespan was in the 70s, the life expectancy, excuse me. And so that's how they made the actuarial calculation for how much money to put aside. But now people are living into their 80s. And guess what? Professors are not average people. Some of them are living into their 90s. And there's just not enough money to pay for it. This pattern is repeating itself throughout the economy, just driving us towards a brick wall. Another meta trend is that people don't want to age and die like their parents. They're more conscious. Also, social media and wearables are creating this massive pressure to stay young and fit constantly. And data enables personalized medicine like never before. So there is the ability to stay healthier for longer, and we're starting to capitalize on it. So people want more of that. In the meanwhile, the sick care system is really hitting its limits. It's not innovating fast enough, and waiting till people get sick is just not enough for most people. And so as a result of that, private spending on healthcare is exploding. And in the meanwhile, it's also true that despite the tiny, tiny funding we put into actually solving aging, there is some promising science and a few new treatments. I'd like to tell you a tale of two longevities. The first is the longevity of today, which is really mostly based on data, personalization, preemptive care, and some biotech. And then the longevity of tomorrow, which is much more about the scientific innovations that can allow us to live much longer and much healthier. The first longevity is really mostly about exercise and nutrition, which remain our best interventions. Today, 80% of the value is coming from that kind of precision and data. More testing, DEXA, the GRAIL test, which is a great innovation to detect cancer early. More people doing their VO2 maxes, the wearables that give you live data constantly, preventative MRIs, and better blood testing. That data can be operationalized and is being operationalized to create much better outcomes in longevity if you interpret longevity as being healthier for longer. It's true, we are getting some benefit there. And maybe the 20% here is about treatments. Some stem cell treatments are coming online, gene therapies, and some things like peptides, rapamycin, tretinoin, and maybe plasmapheresis are some things, among others, that are early but promising. Now, in this context of this first longevity, most of these influencers and people talking about it mention this idea of squaring the curve. This is something that Peter Attia speaks about a lot. And this curve is essentially the curve of decline in health that starts around middle age and then moves all the way until death, where as the decline happens, there's this slope where the reduction in health creates a long chronic disease burden. So people are sicker for longer. They get these different diseases like diabetes, heart disease, cancer, and they stay alive for another 10, 15, 20 years, but their quality of life is lower, their ability to participate in society is lower, and their costs are very, very high. So the idea is that with this first type of longevity, which Peter Attia calls medicine 3.0, and there are others, you intervene and you push out, you square the curve. So you make it possible to live without these diseases for much longer. And then the hope is that you also compress morbidity. So in other words, the period of very ill health where you're very costly and you're experiencing a lot of suffering is going to be much shorter. Unfortunately, these ideas are not clearly supported. There is some morbidity compression among centenarians and super centenarians. So they are in pretty good function and then they are sick or they decline relatively for a short period and then die compared to people who are chronically ill for a long time. But it's not clear that these interventions will actually produce a compressed morbidity. They might be just pushing the curve farther. This is a lot of what the current longevity interventions is focused on. And I like to think about this in the context of a kind of health pyramid. So when you think about these different services out there that many of you may have heard of, from Biograph to Tony Robbins and Peter Diamandis's Life Force or Fountain Life and others, they're really treating these three levels of a pyramid. One, knowing your data. Two, making a plan. And most services that are comprehensive, that are these kind of longevity concierge or longevity clinic, do both of those. And then the top level of the pyramid is to do the plan, which is the hardest piece because it interfaces with the dirtiness of reality. And most services are really not able to do that or don't do it very well. Of course, there are a variety of services also at the bottom layer of the pyramid, everything from blood tests like Function Health, et cetera. And those services are trying to climb the pyramid. So they try to automate the making a plan, et cetera. So this category is growing dramatically because of the changes in data accessibility and personalizability. And it is producing a lot of companies, everything from Elo and Novos and supplements, concierge medicine services replacing the GP and longevity concierges, diagnostic services like InstaLab, Function Health, TrueAge, Prenuvo, Ezra, that do full body MRIs, QBio, and many others. Different apps that use AI that help you fast, that track your wearables measurements, and streamlining getting access to medications like HSRX, HIMS, and others. The key challenge in this category of the longevity of the here and now is understanding what the product mix is versus willingness to pay. Because what people often realize is that the people who really care about their health and are willing to pay are generally a small percentage, and they may already have some duct tape solutions for their needs. And so when you look for people who are willing to pay but don't have some solution, your audience becomes smaller. And if you're charging a large amount, you may find that you're in a red ocean trying to compete for these limited dollars. If you're looking for a wider audience, it's of course harder to get the value proposition right. And not many have succeeded at that yet. You have some pricey comprehensive services that go anywhere from $1,000 to $5,000 a year, which are mostly full body MRIs and some diagnostics on top of that, to as much as $50,000 to $150,000 a year, which are more these private concierge longevity clinics like Peter Attia and others. And there's a slew of things in the middle. Now, I went through a personal journey myself after selling a company in 2021, trying to figure out my way through this labyrinth. It was incredibly difficult. I built a team of a physician, physiotherapist, personal trainer, and an EA to tie it together. And still, it was hard to make sense of all the markers and to execute the plans that we described. So we're very far from optimum, and that's going to produce a lot of economic opportunity. Now, speaking about squaring the curve very briefly, it has great limitations. One is that, when we talk about, hey, you're going to be 90 and healthy, do we mean that you're operating like a 40-year-old? Even Peter Attia doesn't mean that. He talks about the centenarian Olympics, which is some level of functionality, but, it's very limited. It's like, you got a beat up car that's like 30 years old. It still drives, but, it ain't no new Toyota Camry or Tesla, right? So we're really talking about avoiding the diseases and retaining some functionality, but really very limited functionality, and still having very large degradation from aging. Secondly, the risk reduction of the diseases of aging is limited. It's not clear exactly to what degree. And thirdly, the cost savings and morbidity compression are really unclear at this point. The bottom line is your probability of death skyrockets with aging, regardless of trying to square the curve. The other longevity, the second longevity in the tale of two longevities, is about the innovation, the science, the biotech, and getting to some inflection points. So where are we on that? Today, there are about 180 longevity biotech startups, which is up almost 5x from 2015. That's quite amazing, actually. And there are 40 interventions in clinical trials for longevity. That's not nothing. But to keep that in perspective, Pfizer alone has 100 interventions in phase trials at any given point. There are now 20 longevity-focused VCs. About $13 billion in total funding has gone into longevity biotech startups, delivering a valuation total which is a little under $50 billion. And in 2022 alone, there was over $3 billion in funding. But of course, this stuff is very skewed into major efforts like Altos, which got $3 billion on its own. Now, when you think about startup funding by category, just looking at that area of innovation, not at the public funded innovation, which is mostly universities, etc., you have a power law. A lot of the money goes into reprogramming, so Altos and so forth. There are other companies like New Limit, Shift, that are focusing on reprogramming. It's kind of a space race for that. And the other category that gets a lot of capital is regenerative medicine. So regenerating organs, creating new organs, etc. There are many, many other categories that get hardly any funding by comparison in the general startup funding ecosystem. Everything from senescent cells, parabiosis, immune aging, pet interventions, reproductive aging, and much, much more. So people are going after a variety of things, but 80% of them are what we could call small molecule interventions. So they're essentially the pharma model. And only a small 10% each go to discovery approaches like AI and machine learning based identification of targets, and only 10% to more substantial potential innovation categories like regenerative medicine, replacement, and so forth. So replacement being the idea that you could regrow either cells or organs or more and replace them without having to solve aging itself. I mentioned a space race for reprogramming. Calico is investing in it. Retro Biosciences, which is a company funded with $180 million by Sam Altman, New Limit funded by Brian Armstrong, the founder of Coinbase, and Altos Labs, as well as Shift Biosciences, Turn Bio, and others, are all going after this reprogramming category, which, as you may recall, is this scientific breakthrough from the early aughts, from the mid-aughts, where we've discovered how to change older cells to resemble much younger cells. Another category worth noting is pet longevity. So we mentioned this before a little bit, this idea that if you can demonstrate lifespan extension in pets, you may be able to create a company that's very valuable, get it into the market, and unlock a lot more capital. So whether or not that'll unlock tons more capital, I think it's really promising. I'm a small investor in Loyal, and people do want their pets to live longer. So if we can get anything that serves that purpose, that could be a big deal. There are a variety of other companies working on this: Epiturna, Trivium Vet, Rejuvenate Bio, and others. So finally, I'd like to tell you a little bit about Vitalism's concrete plan. It has three core parts that intermingle. The first is unifying and growing the supporters of Vitalist values. So, as I mentioned, maybe 5 to 10% of the world are naturally inclined to these ideas, despite the vast pressure of mainstream perspectives about aging and death. But these people are all over the place and not coordinated. So how do we bring them together? And how do we grow the number of Vitalists? Secondly, we want to spark and amplify a network of Vitalists and Vitalist organizations, meaning that other Vitalists who are doing great work, like this LEVITY podcast, and like companies that speak out about aging and death, even if they're working on something which isn't directly innovating on the biotech. So maybe they're making supplements more available, or they're doing something with wearables, or they're doing something else entirely, but they're speaking out. Or companies that are doing something in the science, we want to elevate them and amplify them so that we can have more influence. This is absolutely critical. And as we unify, grow, and amplify the supporters in this network of Vitalists, we aim to transform jurisdictions into longevity states. That simply means jurisdictions that allocate massive energy, resourcing, and change policies to achieve longevity. I'll speak to that more in a bit. So, if we have this group of Vitalists and we try to amplify them, and we will succeed to amplify them because there's so many people who want this to move forward, and they already help each other, we'll create a virtuous cycle where more individuals create more organizations, deliver more capital and resourcing, and more influence. That will enable us to allocate resources to the things that can actually solve aging. Pharmacology, these small molecule interventions, which I mentioned earlier, that occupy about 80% of funding and attention today, are only really a bridge. They use endogenous mechanisms in the body primarily, and they might buy us another 5 or 10 years of lifespan and health span, but not very much more than that. To really make progress on aging, we need either advanced bioengineering or replacement. So figuring out how to really either undo through understanding the mechanics and the code of life, or replace some of the parts that are harmed with aging. And as a notable mention, a strategy that could buy us time in addition to these pharmacological strategies is biostasis, what people often call cryo. So putting people in some sort of stasis where they could be revived later and then benefit. These are all legitimate approaches, most of which are getting hardly any attention or capital. To conclude, I'd like to speak about this notion of longevity states. Every jurisdiction can become a longevity state. It could be a special economic zone, a state or a prefecture, or a country. And it can do that in different ways through regulatory innovation, public capital investment, or private industry innovation, where our initial goal is for the jurisdiction to allocate at least 1% of its GDP to directly fight aging and death through science and technology. There are some examples of this that are already visible. One inspiration is the Free State Project, which was created to create a libertarian paradise in some place in the world, some jurisdiction. A group of libertarians came together and eventually chose New Hampshire and galvanized local support and got people to move, about 7,000 in total. And over the last 18 years, have reached a point where they now have 20-something members in the New Hampshire House, which is punching 5 times their electoral weight in the population. And they've passed many laws like tax cuts, deregulation, civil forfeiture reform that are in line with their vision. We Vitalists can do similar, and we believe we can do it at a massive scale. I'll give you a few examples of jurisdictions that are moving the longevity state direction. One is Montana, where a senator named Ken Bogner led the passage of a law expanding the right to try, such that anybody, even if they don't have a terminal disease, like in other states in the US, can get access with the approval of their doctor and informed consent to any intervention that passed phase 1 trials. That's monumental because it can expand and increase the tempo of innovation, making it shorter to get access to new innovations. Ken Bogner ran for the House and didn't succeed in the primaries, but the fact that he made a successful run is evidence that candidates can and will make it into Congress to support these goals. And this is partially due to organizations that are supporting these vitalist candidates, like the Longevity Caucus in the US, which was created with the support of A4LI, an organization which is the only lobbying organization in America for longevity. It currently has 5 members of the House of Representatives, and we believe it's going to grow substantially. The second example I'd like to mention is Saudi Arabia, which launched Hevolution, a foundation funded with up to $1 billion a year, allocated to directly solve aging. And Hevolution is very clear about the goal. It's about solving the root cause of aging and extending lifespans and health spans. $1 billion a year is about 0.1% of Saudi Arabia's annual GDP. And one thing worth noting here is that during the Apollo project, a guy called Roger Everett analyzed the economic impact of the investment in the project on GDP and found that every dollar spent on the Apollo project produced $7 to $14 in spillover effects. And so that 0.1% is really quite monumental for Saudi Arabia and may already in some ways make it a longevity state. And finally, in Prospero Honduras, there's a special economic zone which allows interventions to be delivered to customers with a much more progressive regulatory regime. And recently, Brian Johnson of Blueprint fame went down there to get a gene therapy to increase his folstatin level, which is a protein that is associated with muscle building. The company that offered that, called MiniCircle, then got a flood of interest and likely made millions of dollars of revenue from people interested in this kind of treatment. If you're out there and you want to do something about aging and death, then you should join us at Vitalism. If you agree with this stuff, when Nathan and I came up with these concepts and we tried to figure out what to do, we were disheartened to find there was no situation room, no place where there was a group of people we could connect with that was trying hard to change the equation and to really give us a good shot with open communication, transparency, inclusion, and efficacy. And that's what we're trying to build. And we need all Vitalists, everybody who agrees with this, to jump in and help us because we can only win this thing together. That's what we strongly believe in. Thank you for listening to this presentation. And let's jump in.
Thank you, Adam. It's an incredibly thoughtful and well-formulated and rich presentation. And I think it should be quite clear to the listeners and the viewers why we chose this university seminar model where we begin with a presentation and then have a discussion. One of the many things that resonated with me was your observation that there is a deep ambivalence or schizophrenic attitude towards aging and death in our society. I wrote the book, The Case Against Death, because I was triggered by this discrepancy that on the one hand, we have a culture that celebrates life and health and so on. At the same time, we're also afraid of pointing out the, let's say, elephant in the room or the big problem, death and aging. And I think vitalism is among the many virtues is exactly that it's cleared eye on this issue. It says what needs to be said, and that perhaps not even said by, as you pointed out, other longevity affiliated and health affiliated communities.
Yeah, I 100% agree. It's a very deep rooted resistance that we have psychologically to confront aging and death. I feel it myself too. These are not pleasant things to consider. They're affecting our loved ones and ourselves. And sometimes I wish I weren't thinking about it. So I can understand people who don't want to think about it. They're awful things, and it's easy to just distract or avoid or find some way to cope. But unfortunately, that's not going to give us the solutions that we need.
I mean, these ideas of accepting or not looking at the problem directly is something that bears an incredible cost. And I think you were very efficient in pointing out exactly this kind of illogical or inefficiency of the system. That is, it's easy to think that someone is dealing with the problem and that they are doing it in a rational way. But as you pointed out, part of why you're doing this is that you realize that the cavalry isn't coming.
Right. I mean, look, this is something so deep that it relates to the entire history of human existence, right? This notion that we decline and we die. Every social system has been built with that paradigm in mind. And the pension and the social care system and this idea of like living with your elders or having them move in, which is common in some societies and cultures, etc. All of these things are so fundamental to the human experience that questioning them is very hard, especially when you consider that most people are just struggling with their day to day and they have a great stake in the current paradigm. In other words, their entire life strategy was based on this belief that, okay, well, I'm going to work for a certain period, I'm going to save, then I'm going to retire, then I'm going to reap the spoils in some way of my hard work, or I'm going to have some outcome. And my parents are going to age and I need to deal with that and I'm preparing for that, et cetera, et cetera. It's really very upending to even question this.
Can I ask you, Adam, you mentioned Peter Attia quite a few times during your presentation, and of course he's the famous longevity doctor that has a podcast and all sorts of different programs that you can enroll in and so on. And he's often talking about the marginal decade. That what he is proposing is that you should try to change your lifestyle to have a good marginal decade, which is just a fancy word of the last decade of your life. And he's also a proponent of this compression of morbidity, that instead of living with chronic disease for 10 years, you can live with it for 10 months and then die. He is not what you would think about as a death apologist at first glance, but if you think about it a little bit longer, he's maybe more of a death apologist than most people. How should we think about a longevity influencer like Peter Attia?
It's a great question. I'll try to unpack that. So, one question here is, how useful is it to think about the marginal decade, the last decade of life? And I think that given our current circumstances, it is rational to try to optimize that period for people now approaching it. So if you are in your late 60s or 70s and you want to secure as much health span as you can, you know what? Peter Attia, I listened to his podcast. Some of the research there is really fantastic, and it can give people some practical tips for doing things that will help them feel better and function better. And certainly that's something. But I agree with you 100% that there is an implicit and sometimes even explicit nod that approves of the inevitability of aging and death as the mental construct that should be pursued by people. And we should not accept that. So we should call it out. For example, in Peter's book, Outlive, in the opening, he says, I want to say what longevity isn't. This is a paraphrase. It isn't living to 120 or 150. And then he goes on to describe what, in his view, longevity is. But of course, this highlights the problem with the term longevity in the first place, that anybody can appropriate it and define it however they want. Of course, nobody on this podcast would say it's acceptable to say that living to 120 is acceptable at all, which Peter Attia doesn't even define as an acceptable goal. He's aiming for 95 or 100. And for anybody on this goal, on this podcast, it's ethically wrong to accept any fixed number. And so, yes, I totally agree. This must be called out, and we can elevate and celebrate the things that Peter Attia is contributing in. I think he's created a lot of net good for people, but really refuse to accept these other parts.
Again, I think that's such a great virtue of this concept of vitalism, and it just shows how needed it is. Because it's a big difference between being somebody who, like Attia, would be happy to be, healthy till 90 and then just die and be okay with that. And somebody says, no, the logic of being for life is to want to live in an unlimited way.
I would just add to that, by the way, that this ties into this concept of suffering being the problem. Because that is also an implicit part of Peter Attia's mental model. That's very important. And that's something that, as vitalists, we reject. This idea that suffering is the primary problem. So basically saying, hey, if we can just avoid these diseases, we're good. We did what we needed to do. And then we can plop dead happily at 90 or 95 or 100 or whatever it is. So in other words, based on that philosophy, if we had some pill, they would just make us feel good and function to some degree and not have the diseases. And then we plop dead at 75 versus 80. Peter Attia might say, according to that philosophical structure, well, it's just the same. But it's not the same. Living longer is better.
I mean, in fact, even worse than that. I mean, if limiting suffering is our main goal, then not living at all would actually be the logical point. I mean, which is what the antinatalists like David Benatar has argued.
Yeah, it's really quite
And
horrifying. When you take these ideas to their logical conclusion, you realize that they conflict directly with the humanist values that most of us cherish.
I think if you're going to play the devil's advocate here for a while, I think that maybe Peter Attia would favor a prolonged lifespan if he felt that it was feasible to actually go after that. He doesn't clearly. I think he thinks it's science fiction, and
Right.
so there you part ways because you think it's maybe equally hard, but it's certainly not science fiction. It's certainly something that we should pursue, but it's really difficult. Maybe not mostly for the scientific challenges, but because of the way you framed it with how society is set up to deal with this new challenge that we have.
I think that's a really great comment. And it highlights the nuance, which is you can talk about operating within the current paradigm and you can say, hey, listen, I think the odds of success with longevity science are low. But if you've taken that low and you've rounded it down to zero, you're actually engaging in religious belief. You religiously believe that solving aging in any way is just impossible without good evidence to prove it. And as somebody who prides himself on being driven by the evidence, this is an untenable position. And so if you accept that there is some probability, there may be an unknown probability, that we may impact aging, you must also say, well, that would be a good. Even if you acknowledge that today that may be inaccessible for whatever reason, you might say, yes, but we should aspire towards that. Maybe not in my generation, maybe future generations will benefit from this. And then I would just say, well, if that's true and one acknowledges this, so they're not saying that it's fine to die at 120. They just say like, well, we can't do more. So, we're dealing with what we have and we aspire to more, which is the right language to use. But you might say, well, it's a foible. Then I would just say, look, you look at resource allocation. Is it reasonable to spend, a thousandth of our resources on trying to use technology and science to do something about aging? Is that a correct way to allocate society's efforts? I think that that's just really hard to defend. And so that's where I would push back.
I think this also highlights a particular inability of people to think ideally about death and aging. Because if you ask people, how many wars should I ideally be? People will say zero, or how much crime should there be, or etc. etc. They will say zero. Like the peace movement, right, will say, we should strive for this. It would be ideal. It would be better if there was complete peace in the world, and no one was victimized, or there wouldn't be anything that's unjust or something like that. But when it comes to this, it's like they say, well, we don't quite think it's possible, so we don't want it.
Yes, yes. And, I would just add to that, there's a really interesting question around the cause and effect of this idea that it's infeasible. So is the idea that it's infeasible a result of a resistance to confronting aging and death? So in other words, you hear about this concept and then immediately you get it, in meditation, we say that you have a sensation in the body first and then you label it. So for example, you don't actually feel anger. There's a sensation in the body, which is a negative sensation, which is subconscious. And then you label it as anger. Oh, I must be angry right now. And they showed that with experiments where they give people something, I forget if it was adrenaline or cortisol, and then they put them around a clown versus an angry person. And the people who were around the clown said, oh, I felt, excited and happy. And the people who were next to the angry person were like, I felt angry, etc. So we know that we have these kind of biological biases. And in this context, you think about aging and death and you'd say, okay, that's going to produce a bad reaction, right? It's a very terrifying thing. So I'm immediately having a physiological reaction that's subconscious to it. And then what do? I need to explain it away. So I create a confabulation, some explanation that will make it okay so I don't have to engage with it. And a good explanation to not engage with it is, well, I can't do anything about it. So I may as well put it in a box and never think about it again. And so what's a way to describe it as? To say it's impossible. It's just infeasible. Hey, I'm too late to benefit. And that's a way to confront this issue. And so in a sense, and the reason I think this is the more likely explanation for most people, because I hear it from many ultra high net worth people I talk to. So I'll talk to somebody who's worth $100 million and I'll say, hey, X, longevity, you want to live longer, right? They'll say, sure. I say, well, so why don't you put more money into it? You have $100 million, for God's sake. You just built like a $15 million house. Why you haven't put even $1? And they tell me, well, I think it's impossible. So I'm like, all right, why do you think it's impossible? Are you a PhD in biology? Did you spend $1 million to recruit a team to investigate whether it's possible or not possible? Have you done any work to come to that conclusion? And the answer is 99.999% of the cases, no. So if that's the answer, what does that suggest to you? To me, it sounds like capital excuse. It's a way to not confront the issue, because I'll give you a counterexample of this. So one of you has a parent. The parent is ill with cancer. You went to the doctor and you're worth $100 million, right? And the doctor says, I'm sorry, Peter, your dad has terminal cancer, some very bad one, and he's going to die in 4 months. Now, many people would say, well, too bad for me. Let's go out drinking and, it is what it is. But typically people who are entrepreneurs or people who are active, many people, by the way, not just a small percentage of people, they'll say, all right, that's one opinion. That's his opinion. I'm going to go and talk to another doctor. And when the other doctor says your dad's going to die, you say, fuck you. I'm going to talk to a third doctor. And when the third doctor says that, you know what they do? They go to PubMed and they start scouring the literature to find if there's any study anywhere that maybe somebody found something that could solve this cancer. Now compare this to this idea of like, oh, but aging, it's totally impossible. So I'm not going to allocate any time or money into it, even though it's going to kill me and all my loved ones. I just don't, it doesn't hold water.
Is that your concept, the billionaire paradox?
Yes.
Well, that's a good example of just how you pay attention to how we message.
Yeah. I think coining terms that can easily convey these concepts is very important for our movement. Because it's, memes are a key to communication, and there's been so much miscategorization in this idea around what is aging, what is life extension.
But also the billionaire paradox, it's good because it's a counter to an incredibly tired trope among journalists of describing what we are doing as something fanciful only for billionaires, right? The billionaires are trying to cure aging. And then you say, well, no, here's the real truth. And it's also a trope, and that is the billionaire paradox. The billionaires mostly do not want to cure aging and death, right? It's 1/100% of their net worth is spent on doing this. And yet, these are the headlines. Absurd. What do you think explains that pitch?
It's just absolute sensationalism. I mean, it's it's a great story. Billionaires, so a villain, or somebody who probably shouldn't have that money, or it evokes feelings of envy and jealousy, whether or not they should or shouldn't. And now they want to, through their hubris, achieve the unachievable. And it has this kind of combination of like aspiration and negative emotions and then fantasy. And so I think it captures a lot of the imagination. And, I'll just, yeah, sorry, go ahead. What do you,
Yeah, and I think it's a particularly dangerous trope, actually, because well, first of all, it makes people less excited about this, and it's something that could benefit, of course, more than the billionaires. But it's also kind of evoking negative moral connotations around the whole project, and it's unnecessary, and also even political ones.
I totally agree. And I would add to that it by definition marginalizes the issue. It basically says, you, Peter, you, Patrick, you, Adam, you normies, oh, you don't need to worry about aging and death. That's something that billionaires worry about, as if you're not aging and dying yourself.
It also doesn't seem to ring true when you know people within the longevity community, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you know, I've noticed that there's actually no relationship or a very low relationship between demographics or wealth to people's perception of aging and death, which is actually quite a surprising finding that people don't talk enough about.
No, that's actually true, and it's borne out by the Pew Research, the Pew Research Center survey on this issue, where actually people on a lower economic status actually were more favorable to life extension.
Yeah, I was going to add before that there are factors that may influence people's willingness to live longer, or rather, interest, appetite to live longer. For example, how happy they are. That makes sense. If you're very depressed or unhappy, you may not want to continue living for very much longer. You're having a hard life. And I think that there is a relationship, for example, between suffering and the desire to live longer, right? If you're in a great amount of pain, you may not want to, that's not your top priority. You're just thinking about your current suffering. So I think there are true aspects where we need to address people's concerns in the present. And this actually ties into something very important, which is, here we are saying fighting aging death, solving it should be humanity's number one priority. Okay, but that doesn't mean there shouldn't be any other priorities. If you came to me and you said, hey, Adam, we have a budget of $100. Should we put all of it towards this? I would say no, because we have the rest of the economy and other things to take care of. And even if you said, well, only in health, and I would say also no, because there are people who are suffering right now. They should get some of the resources as well, because we don't know. This is speculative. Maybe it'll take a very long time to solve this. And meanwhile, people are suffering. So we should also consider suffering as a factor. But right now, that factor is 99.99999% of the pie, instead of what it should be, which is maybe 50% of the pie.
You've encountered, can I go, Patrick? You've encountered a lot of myths around what would happen if we were to solve aging. The boredom myth, the overpopulation myth. Why do you think these myths are coming up when it comes to solving aging as opposed to curing diseases? I mean, no one would say that if we cured cancer, we would get bored. Okay, then you could say that, yeah, but if we cured cancer, you would only get a few more years. But they wouldn't say that if we cured a lot of age-related diseases or aging-caused diseases, as you pointed out before, and you would prolong lifespan quite a bit, they wouldn't have those arguments, right? If we are curing diseases, overpopulation is not a problem, but if we're solving aging, it is.
Yeah. Two ideas come to mind on this. One is that when you talk about curing a disease, you're offering something that's been done before. We've eradicated polio. So you're talking about an acceptable something within the Overton window. So they would think,
Can
well,
you explain what the Overton window is for people who don't know that?
so the Overton window is the range of ideas that are acceptable at a given time. And so because there's some history of acceptability or plausibility of eradicating a disease, people don't start thinking in terms of mental models for all of humanity and society changing. Whereas when you say, if I cure aging, you're questioning something very foundational. And so the level of their thinking goes to that foundational level of hierarchy. That's one explanation for why the brain might gravitate towards that. And so they start thinking at a higher level, or let's say a more foundational level. And then the other reason I think is that it's a bit of grasping for straws. Because you're basically saying, well, what if everybody was happy all the time? Okay, it sounds like a great thing. So now I have to come up with something. I have to really use my imagination to come up with some idea for why it would be bad. So, you might say, well, it would be boring, for example, right? It would be the same. So, I think those are two reasons that you have these responses. But ultimately, they are what I would call confabulations. They're not real. They're just imaginary ways for people to avoid confrontation. I made this presentation to about 1,500 post-exit founders, so people who've sold their companies, so entrepreneurs. And one of the slides in that presentation is, it shows this weight, and on one side is like health versus wealth. And basically at some point in life, health becomes a lot heavier than wealth. It becomes the dominant concern. And then, when I say that, everybody is nodding furiously in agreement. And then when you say, and that aging is the top impact factor on your health. And then you say, and how much energy or money have you put towards the topic of aging? Basically, the nods disappear and it's a complete silence.
But, I mean, you come in contact with people that actually has money to spend on this. Do they come around at some point, or is there? Do you get some leeway when you're trying to really explain the challenges and what is actually possible to them?
So the answer is sometimes, but to a very limited degree. This is one of the chief questions that I think about, because getting resources and support from people who control those resources is really important. I have a few kind of reasons I came up with that I think motivate these people not to take action, or structural reasons they don't take action. And then I'll explain what I think might change the game a little bit. One is, people who are ultra high net worth are kind of self-selected for that. In other words, at every point in their journey towards being ultra high net worth, they chose to focus on making more money. So there's a group like that. Not everybody. Sometimes somebody just got lucky. They went from 20 million to 2 billion because the value of their company skyrocketed, etc. In other cases, they just get stuck. So they talk to one expert because it's too overwhelming. And then that expert basically just kind of funnels their attention into their pet project. And so they're just kind of disoriented. And then they go somewhere. And then another part of this is, they typically think about the hammer that they know to hit the nail. And what is the hammer they know? Capitalism. And so whenever you talk about, well, we need more R&D, or there's some things that need to be funded that are a market failure, that the market isn't funding because it's too early, they'll be like, I don't know anything about that, what are you talking about? Or they say like, I, who am much poorer than you, have donated $1,000 to this thing, right? And they'll just say, donations, that's like setting money on fire. You know what I mean? So sometimes it's about just twisting it and showing very pragmatic units of progress that they feel they might be able to achieve, and that gets people to act to some degree. Promising them some access to some direct benefit, like early access to therapeutics, could work. Basically pitching the idea as more of a capitalist idea. We're going to do a fund, and then there will be some upside from this in some way if this works, maybe over a long period. I think those are mechanisms that can work, but it is very hard.
What about Jeff Bezos? Because he is a big investor, from what I understand, in Altos Labs. Is he bucking the trend, and isn't it a way to actually point at Bezos and say that, look at this guy and what he's doing? He's believing in this.
Well, I don't know if this is true, but I've heard that he only put a relatively small amount inside Altos and mainly contributed the name brand, and that the majority came from Yuri Milner. I don't know if this is true. I don't have like a special access there. These are just rumors. But look, the guy's worth 200 billion. If you were worth 200 billion, would you at least be on the record at any point, anywhere, saying, hey, aging is a major problem and I'm going to focus on it? I mean, I don't think he really cares very much. I think for him, it's an afterthought. Somebody mentioned it to him. And even if he put in $1 billion, that's like, it's still an afterthought. So what? And, but I think in this case, he probably put in a lot less money, and he probably forgot about it the next day. He's busy building Blue Origin. He's busy doing other things, having fun in Miami. And ultimately, look, I would love to get him to be on board and support in any way. Even $100,000 could help a project make progress. But I think the important thing is that we need people who are willing to speak out and take a stance on this, not just put in some money, because the people who don't have a perspective, who are not willing to take a stance, are ultimately going to just put in a very small amount of attention, energy, and capital into it. That's what I believe. So I don't mean this to diminish or criticize anybody. I hope that all these people do put in a lot of resources. I just think that the role of somebody like Brian Johnson, who is willing to speak out, or Brian Armstrong from Coinbase, who is willing to speak out and do and say, yes, aging, longevity, those are the most important things outside of what I'm doing at Coinbase. And that's why I put $100 million of my own money. He's much less wealthy than Bezos, into New Limit, and I'm a co-founder of it. Very different animals. We need more Brian Armstrongs than Jeff Bezos is when we talk about this.
Do you think that most people really are vitalists, including the billionaires, but they don't quite know it yet, or they're suppressing it? Or
using that framing would empty the word vitalist of its meaning, because on the one hand, I do believe that every person has the biological imperative survival instinct, and they do want to live longer, and they do want to live healthy as long as possible. So in that sense, yes, everybody's a vitalist. And so maybe it is a good thing to claim that everybody deep down is a vitalist, except some of them don't know it yet. And so, you know what, maybe we should adopt that.
I don't know, because I mean, we are often in discussion, for example, on Twitter with people who really don't think that they are vitalists, people who are really ardent defenders of death and limitations. And, they say life is human life because it has a certain, it's 80 years, 100 years, and otherwise it's not human, and so on. It's like, we are saying, well, these are, as you said, these are made up, or these are intellectualizations, and so on. It's just, or is it just because are we particular people who have this inclination and we just can't imagine that not everybody really is that way? I mean, that's quite typical for someone who believes
Yeah.
something.
Um, I'm not sure. I think we need to do a lot more research, and we intend to do a lot more research on this topic as we um, grow the community and deploy more efforts into this. But I will say that there are exceptions in the population where some people commit suicide, some people are really depressed, some people are wired differently. 1% of people are schizophrenic. So certainly there is a substantial proportion of people for whom these concepts may be completely foreign, and there's some kind of predisposition to veer away from them. I think the vast majority of the population has a predisposition to avoid confrontation with the unpleasant reality of aging and death, but want to live longer in great health.
I think that one of the things that augurs well for vitalism and can give us some reason for optimism that it will prosper is really how consistent we are with some of the kind of deeply held beliefs in society and also expressed beliefs in society. I mean, we are more logical, I feel, than those who say, well, 90 and then no more in health and so on.
We're also offering a better product. They just think there's too much technical risk. That's the startup lingo about this. People look at it and they say, these dudes. Yeah, I mean, if they manage to pull it off, great. I'll be the first to take the pill. But let's be real. They have a very low chance of success. Now, I don't know what the chance of success is, but I know that life is great. So I'll take any chance I can get, and I think we do have a chance.
It's just it seems that the kind of socially accepted endpoint to health and life is incredibly arbitrary, given that we already think that everybody has the right to life and that optimal health is the goal. I mean, I'm just quoting like the UN and WHO and right in the Constitution and so on. So we are the consistent ones, and I think that goes back to your issue here of we shouldn't self-marginalize. We should claim, in some sense, to be mainstream.
I totally agree, and I think that when you look at the history of humanity and the human condition, our understanding of reality, I mean, the evidence is just that it's so limited, right? 500 years ago, we didn't know that the Earth was not the center of the world. Nobody knew that we were basically suspended in this void, spinning around at whatever 68,000 kilometers per second. I mean, guys, this is just so crazy. Anybody who takes even a second to think about the level of what humanity has achieved and how little we've understood and how little we probably still understand should have the humility to not shrug off that achieving indefinite lifespans or extremely long lifespans and great health should be on the menu of options.
Adam, you've said or you talked about earlier that many countries are on their way to insolvency because of the spending on sick care.
Yes.
Is it all to do about this vicious cycle that you mentioned, or is there some other reason that we are so slow at turning this ship around? Because I think there is, at least in Sweden, I see among caregivers a realization that we should. I forgot the word. I mean that we should intervene in the process before people get sick.
Yeah.
So why is it so difficult to actually turn this ship around?
I think the incentives are just built to maintain the current structure. A lot of people make money on the medications and sick care system and the hospital system. And so reversing the trend is very hard. And if you think about it, the youth who don't consume a lot of medical care are effectively subsidizing the elderly who are consuming a lot of this medical care. So if you take money and you want to say, let's put it in prevention, where are you taking it from? People who are suffering from some acute thing that you're now treating for very large costs. And so politically, this is just like structurally very unfavorable. So the game theory is that whoever makes the decision will never have sufficient motivation to actually swallow the bitter pill. So even though there's kind of this realization, many would agree with it, even in politics, it's hard for them to take the step. But guys, I'm afraid I have to leave. I feel like we could discuss more, but I have to pick up my daughter from school.
Yeah. No problem. But Adam, just where can people get in touch with you, and if they want to reach out?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter, just at Adam Gries, ADAMGRIES. And please sign up on vitalism.io and join us.
Thank you, Adam,
Thank you.
for joining us for this conversation. And I hope we'll have many more conversations.
Thank you very much. It's been amazing talking to you guys.